New Orleans, Louisiana, April 1842. On a humid evening when the air hung thick as velvet over the French Quarter, a slave girl appeared at the most exclusive salon in the city, wearing diamonds that shouldn't exist, not imitation stones or colored glass. Real diamonds, a necklace worth more than most plantations, earrings that caught candlelight and threw it back like captured stars, and a bracelet that 3 of the city's most prominent jewelers would later swear contained stones they'd only seen once before, 20 years earlier, in a collection that had vanished under circumstances no one would discuss. Within 2 weeks of her appearance, the host of that salon would be found dead in circumstances the authorities would rule natural causes, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Within a month, 5 of New Orleans' wealthiest families would be locked in a silent war, each searching for answers to questions they couldn't ask publicly. And within 3 months, the slave girl herself would disappear, leaving behind only the diamonds, arranged on a table in a pattern that those who saw it described as a message written in light and stone, a message that would haunt the city's elite for decades. Who was this girl who walked into New Orleans society wearing impossible wealth? Where did the diamonds come from? And what secrets did they represent that powerful families would rather burn the city than let emerge? Before we unravel what became known in whispered conversations as the Diamond Ghost Mystery, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. What you're about to hear involves levels of corruption and moral horror that New Orleans spent generations trying to erase from history. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're building a community of people who refuse to let uncomfortable truths stay buried. The truth begins not with the girl, but with the diamonds themselves, and a crime committed 2 decades before her appearance. Spring 1842 found New Orleans at the height of its golden age. The city had become the 4th largest in America, its port handling more commerce than anywhere outside New York. Cotton and sugar flowed through its warehouses in quantities that made fortunes overnight. And those fortunes built the mansions of the Garden District, funded the Opera House, and supported a social hierarchy as rigid and complex as anything in Europe. At the top of that hierarchy sat the Creole families, old money from France and Spain, people whose bloodlines supposedly justified their positions. The Beaumont family controlled shipping interests that touched 3 continents. Alexandre Beaumont, patriarch of 62 years, had built his empire through strategic marriages, calculated alliances, and a ruthlessness he disguised behind impeccable manners. His daughter Isabel served as the family's social general, hosting salons that determined who mattered in New Orleans society. Just below the Creole elite were the American merchants, newcomers with fresh money and ambitions to match. The Morrison family represented this class. Thomas Morrison had arrived from Philadelphia 15 years earlier with capital and connections. He'd married into Creole society through his wife Celeste, a Beaumont cousin, buying legitimacy through wealth and strategic friendship with Alexandra. His son Robert, 28 years old, was being groomed to take over the family's cotton factoring business and possibly run for political office. The third tier of power belonged to the professional class. Lawyers, doctors, jewelers, and merchants who served the wealthy but maintained their own considerable influence. Among these, 3 names dominated. Jacques Mercier, jeweler to the elite, whose shop on Royal Street held stones worth more than small nations. Dr. Henri Duclos, physician to Creole families, keeper of their medical secrets and by extension their social vulnerabilities, and Antoine Devereaux, attorney whose discretion made him invaluable to families conducting business they preferred, remain unrecorded. These 3 men, along with the Beaumont and Morrison families, formed the core of New Orleans' power structure in 1842. They existed in carefully balanced competition, allies when convenient, enemies when profitable, united only in their determination to maintain the social order that favored them. It was into this carefully controlled world that rumors began circulating in early April. A slave girl of unusual appearance had been seen in the French Quarter. Not unusual in itself. New Orleans had a complex racial hierarchy where free people of color, enslaved people, and whites mixed in ways that would have scandalized other southern cities. But this girl was different. Young, perhaps 18 or 19, with features that suggested mixed heritage. Skin the color of amber, hair that fell in dark waves past her shoulders, eyes of an unusual shade between brown and gold that seemed to shift in different light. But it wasn't her appearance that sparked whispers, it was what she wore. During the day she dressed simply, in the plain cotton that marked her status. But on 3 separate occasions, reliable witnesses had seen her in the evening, moving through the quarter in clothes that suggested wealth and wearing jewelry that couldn't possibly belong to a slave. The first sighting was dismissed as mistaken identity or exaggeration. The second caused conversation. The third prompted investigation. Isabel Beaumont first heard about the girl during her Tuesday salon, a weekly gathering where the city's elite assembled to conduct the real business of New Orleans under the pretense of social conversation. The salon took place in the Beaumont Mansion on Esplanade Avenue, a 3-story Greek revival house with galleries that overlooked formal gardens. Isabel presided over these gatherings with absolute authority, her approval or disapproval capable of making or destroying social positions. The evening of April 10th began as always. Guests arrived at 7, servants, all enslaved, all trained to invisibility, moved through rooms offering wine and delicacies. Conversations flowed in French and English, touching on business, politics, and scandal in careful measure. Isabel held court from a settee near the fireplace, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her mind cataloguing every useful piece of information that emerged. It was Madame Celeste Morrison who mentioned the slave girl, carefully casual in a way that suggested the topic was anything but. "Isabel, have you heard about the curious situation in the quarter? A slave girl wearing jewelry that simply cannot be real, yet multiple people swear appears genuine." Isabel's expression didn't change, but her attention sharpened. Curious indeed. Whose slave? Surely someone claims ownership. That's what makes it strange. No one has come forward. The girl appears and disappears. Some say she's staying at a boarding house on Rampart Street, but when inquiries are made, the proprietor claims ignorance. Jacques Mercier, the jeweler, set down his glass with unusual force. "I've heard about this. One of my assistants claims to have seen her 3 days ago, wearing earrings he swears match a pair I made 20 years ago for." He stopped abruptly, glancing at Alexandra Beaumont, whose face had gone carefully blank. "For whom, Jacques?" Isabel asked, her voice deceptively gentle. "For a client whose business I'm not at liberty to discuss." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Everyone in the room understood what wasn't being said. 20 years ago, the Beaumont family had suffered a scandal that nearly destroyed them. Alexandra's wife, Marguerite, had disappeared along with a significant portion of the family's jewelry collection. The official story was that she died during a yellow fever outbreak, and her jewels were buried with her, a Creole custom. But rumors suggested something darker. That Marguerite had tried to run away, that Alexandra had done something to prevent it, that the jewels had been disposed of to hide evidence of crime. No one spoke of this openly. The Beaumont family was too powerful, too connected, but everyone remembered, and now a slave girl was wearing jewelry that might connect to that buried scandal. Robert Morrison, reading the room's tension, attempted to lighten the mood. "Surely there's a simple explanation. Perhaps the stones are exceptional fakes. Or the girl is actually free but pretending to be enslaved for some incomprehensible reason. Or," Dr. Duclos said quietly, "someone is making a point, sending a message through this girl that they expect certain people to understand." Isabel stood, signaling the evening's end more abruptly than usual. "Speculation serves no one. If there's substance to these rumors, I'm certain the appropriate authorities will investigate. Now, I believe it's grown late." But as guests departed, Isabel pulled her father aside. Alexandra Beaumont's composure had cracked slightly, enough that his daughter recognized genuine fear beneath his usual control. "The Thornwood diamonds," Alexandra said quietly once they were alone. "If that girl is wearing Marguerite's jewelry, then someone knows what happened. Someone has been waiting 20 years to use that knowledge. Perhaps the girl is simply a thief who acquired the jewels through normal criminal channels and chose to wear them publicly in the one city where they would be recognized. No, Isabel, this is deliberate. Someone wants us to see them. Someone wants us to know that our secrets aren't as buried as we thought." Isabel studied her father, seeing for the first time the old man beneath the powerful exterior. What really happened to Mother? Alexandra turned away, his voice barely audible. "Nothing that can be undone. Nothing that won't destroy us if it comes to light. We need to find this girl. Quietly. Before anyone else learns what she represents." But they were already too late. Because while the Beaumont Salon discussed the slave girl in hypotheticals, Thomas Morrison was having her followed by private investigators. Dr. Duclos was making inquiries through his network of contacts in the free black community, and Antoine Devereaux was reviewing property records and old court documents, searching for any transaction involving significant jewelry sales 20 years earlier. The girl they sought moved through New Orleans like smoke, visible but impossible to catch. She'd been seen at the French market at dawn, buying flowers from a vendor who later couldn't describe her face, only the diamonds that caught the rising sun. She'd attended Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, kneeling in the back pew, her jewelry creating enough distraction that the priest stumbled through his homily. She'd walked along the levee at dusk, the Mississippi behind her like molten metal, her diamonds competing with the sunset. And everywhere she appeared she was noticed, remembered, discussed, but never caught, never questioned, never identified with certainty. The slave who claimed to own her changed with each telling. Some said she belonged to a cotton factor from Baton Rouge, others insisted she was the property of a Creole widow on Rampart Street. A few suggested she was actually free, but wearing the diamonds as part of some incomprehensible game. The contradictions made investigation impossible. There was no official record of her, no bill of sale, no owner coming forward to reclaim stolen property or explain the mystery. It was as if she existed in the gaps between official reality and actual experience. Present, but impossible to pin down. Real, but somehow outside the normal rules that govern New Orleans society. Robert Morrison finally caught up with her on the evening of April 14th, 4 days after Isabel's salon. He'd been searching the French Quarter systematically, paying informants, following leads that evaporated into dead ends. But that evening, as he walked past Jackson Square, he saw her sitting on a bench near the iron fence, watching children play in the fading light. He approached carefully, aware that she'd evaded better investigators than himself. As he drew closer, he understood why people struggled to describe her. Her beauty wasn't conventional, but there was something magnetic about her presence. She wore a simple dress, nothing remarkable. But around her neck hung the diamond necklace that had sparked all this investigation. In the evening light, it seemed to glow with its own illumination. "Excuse me," Robert said, trying to sound casual. "I wonder if you might help me. I'm looking for someone, and you seem like you might know the quarter well." She turned to him with eyes that held amusement and something else. Knowledge, perhaps, or pity. "And who are you looking for, Mr. Morrison?" The fact that she knew his name stopped him cold. "How did you? You've been asking questions about me for 4 days. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I wouldn't know exactly who you are and why you're searching?" Robert recovered his composure. "Then you'll understand my curiosity. A slave girl wearing diamonds worth more than most plantations. It raises questions. I'm sure it does. But are they the questions you really want answered, or are you asking about jewelry to avoid asking about more dangerous things? I don't understand, don't you? Your family's wealth comes from cotton factoring, moving crops from plantation to market, taking a percentage of transactions built on stolen labor and stolen lives. You've never questioned where that money comes from, never asked about the human cost. But you'll investigate a girl wearing diamonds because that disrupts your comfortable certainties. The accusation struck Robert like a physical blow. He'd heard abolitionists make similar arguments, had dismissed them as radical ideology. But hearing it from this strange girl, stated as simple fact rather than political position, somehow made it harder to ignore. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who knows what you did," she replied. "Someone who knows what all of you did. The Beaumonts, the Morrisons, the professional men who profit from your commerce. You think your crimes are buried. You think 20 years is enough distance. But some debts don't expire. Some truths refuse to stay hidden." "What crimes? What are you talking about?" But she was already standing, moving away from him with that strange grace. Robert followed, calling after her, but she turned down a narrow passage between buildings, and when he reached it seconds later, the passage was empty. She'd vanished again, leaving him with more questions than answers, and a growing dread that something was coming, something that had been building for 20 years. He returned home to find his father waiting with Dr. Duclos and Antoine Devereux. The three men sat in Thomas Morrison's study, their expressions grave. A bottle of brandy sat between them, already half empty, though it was barely 8 o'clock. "We have a problem," Thomas said without preamble. "A significant problem that goes beyond mysterious jewelry." Robert poured himself a glass, his hand shaking slightly. "I just spoke with the girl. She knows about us. About our families. She said something about crimes and debts." The three older men exchanged glances. Finally, Dr. Duclos spoke. 20 years ago, there was an incident. Several of us were involved, including Alexandra Beaumont. It was handled quietly, expensively. Everyone who needed to be paid was paid. Every record that needed to disappear did disappear. We thought it was finished. What incident? A woman died. Alexandra's wife, Marguerite. The official story was yellow fever. The truth was more complicated. She'd discovered something about how her family's wealth was generated, about the slave trade and specific transactions that even by the standards of that commerce were unconscionable. She threatened to go public, to expose not just her family but everyone connected to their business, including us. Robert felt his stomach tighten. "And you killed her?" "We prevented a disaster," Antoine Devereux corrected coldly. "One woman's moral crisis would have destroyed a dozen families, ruined hundreds of people whose only crime was succeeding in the world as they found it. We made a choice. A difficult choice, but necessary. And the diamonds were supposed to have disappeared with her body. We disposed of her in the swamp outside the city. The jewelry should have gone with her, but apparently it didn't. Apparently, someone found her. Someone recovered the diamonds. And now, 20 years later, that someone is using them to send a message." Thomas Morrison leaned forward, his face haggard. "The question is who? Who found her? Who kept this secret for 2 decades? And what do they want from us now?" Robert thought about the girl's strange words, about debts and truths refusing to stay hidden. Maybe they don't want anything from us. Maybe they just want us to know that they know. Maybe this is about revelation, not profit. "Then we're facing something worse than blackmail, Doctor," Duclos said quietly. "Blackmailers can be paid, bargained with. But someone seeking exposure, someone who wants the truth known regardless of cost, that's an enemy we can't buy off or threaten." The 4 men sat in silence, each contemplating the disaster approaching them. Outside, New Orleans continued its evening rhythms. Music drifted from nearby saloons. Carriages rattled past on cobblestone streets. The city breathed and moved, unaware that at its highest levels the foundation was beginning to crack. And somewhere in the French Quarter, the girl with impossible diamonds prepared for her next appearance. An appearance that would take place not in shadows or passages, but in the most public venue possible, at Isabelle Beaumont's salon, in front of everyone who mattered in New Orleans society. She would walk through the front door as if she belonged there. She would wear every diamond that Marguerite Beaumont had owned, and she would sit in Isabelle's drawing room, silent and beautiful and terrifying, while the city's elite confronted the physical manifestation of their buried crimes. The invitation she carried bore Isabel's forged signature, perfect in every detail. Getting past the door would be easy. What came after would be more complicated, but she'd waited 20 years for this moment. 20 years of planning, of gathering evidence, of preparing for the revelation that would shatter New Orleans' carefully maintained lies. Her name was Lisette. She'd been 10 years old when Marguerite Beaumont died in the swamp. 10 years old and enslaved by the Beaumont family. 10 years old and hidden in the carriage on the night they took Marguerite out to kill her. 10 years old and witness to everything. She'd escaped that night, running through the swamp with Marguerite's diamonds clutched in her small hands, the only thing she'd been able to save from the death she'd witnessed. She'd been raised by free people of color who'd found her half-drowned and terrified. She'd spent 2 decades learning everything she could about the men who'd killed her mistress, about their business dealings, their families, their vulnerabilities. And now she was ready to make them see her, ready to make them remember what they'd done, ready to reveal secrets that New Orleans had spent 20 years trying to bury. The reckoning was about to begin, and it would be written in diamonds and blood and truth that refused to stay hidden in swamps. Isabel Beaumont's salon on the evening of April 17th would be remembered by those who attended as the night New Orleans society fractured, not visibly, not with dramatic confrontations or public scandal, but underneath the surface, in the careful silences and avoided gazes, everyone present understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the world they'd known was ending and something darker was emerging to replace it. The evening began normally. Guests arrived in their finest clothes, stepping from carriages into the gaslit entrance of the Beaumont mansion. Isabel received them in the main parlor, her smile precise and calculated, her words chosen to flatter and probe in equal measure. By 8 o'clock, 40 of New Orleans' most influential people had assembled. Merchants and planters, lawyers and doctors, Creole aristocrats and American newcomers, all united by wealth, by social position, and by unspoken agreements about what could and couldn't be discussed in polite company. Alexandre Beaumont stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid despite his casual conversation. He'd been drinking since afternoon, trying to steady nerves that hadn't troubled him in 20 years. Thomas Morrison sat nearby with his son Robert, both men watching the door with barely concealed anxiety. Dr. Duclos and Antoine Devereaux had positioned themselves near the exits, as if anticipating the need for rapid departure. They all felt it, the tension in the air, the sense that something was coming. Lisette arrived at 8:30, precisely when the salon had reached its full attendance. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that must have cost more than most people earned in a year, but it was the diamonds that drew every eye the moment she entered. Marguerite Beaumont's complete collection, pieces that hadn't been seen in public for 2 decades, a necklace of stones so perfectly cut they seemed to hold captured fire, earrings that swayed and caught light with every movement, bracelets on both wrists, a brooch at her throat, and a tiara that no slave, no free person of color, no one without royal blood should have dared to wear. The room fell silent. 40 conversations stopped mid-sentence as everyone turned to stare at this impossible apparition. A slave girl dressed as a princess, wearing jewelry that shouldn't exist, walking into the most exclusive salon in New Orleans as if she had every right to be there. Isabel Beaumont's face went white, then red, then white again. She started toward Lisette, fury and fear warring in her expression. But Alexandre caught her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Not here," he hissed. "Not publicly. We handle this quietly." But quiet was no longer possible, because Lisette didn't stand in the doorway waiting to be challenged or dismissed. She walked calmly into the center of the room, her bearing suggesting nobility rather than bondage, her eyes meeting the stares directed at her with something approaching pity. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear and cultured, French accent perfect. "Thank you for receiving me, Mademoiselle Beaumont. I know my invitation was unconventional, but I have something to share with you all." A story that I believe will interest everyone present. You have no invitation, Isabel said, trying to reassert control. You're trespassing. Someone summon the authorities immediately. By all means, Lisette replied calmly. Summon them. Let's make this as public as possible. I'm certain the newspapers would love to cover the arrest of a slave girl wearing diamonds that supposedly were buried with Marguerite Beaumont 20 years ago. I'm sure no awkward questions would be asked about how I came to possess them. The threat stopped everyone. The assembled guests looked at each other, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a social disruption. This was planned, calculated, a trap that had been years in the making. Robert Morrison stood, trying to defuse the situation. Perhaps we should hear what she has to say, privately. There's no need for this to become a spectacle. But that's exactly what it needs to be, Lisette said. A spectacle. Because what I'm about to reveal has been hidden in private for too long. It's time for truth to be spoken in public, in front of witnesses who can't pretend they didn't hear. She moved to the center of the room, turning slowly so everyone could see the diamonds clearly. These jewels belong to Marguerite Beaumont. I know because I was there the night she received them as a wedding gift. I was 10 years old, enslaved by the Beaumont family, assigned to serve Madame Marguerite in her personal chambers. I saw her wear these diamonds to parties and salons. I saw her take them off each night and lock them in her jewelry box. I saw everything that happened in her private life. Alexandra Beaumont's face had gone ashen. This is fantasy, the ravings of a delusional girl seeking attention. Is it? Then perhaps you can explain how I have these diamonds, how I know that Marguerite had a specific ritual for wearing them, that she always put on the left earring first, then the right, that she had a small scar on her collarbone just beneath where the necklace clasp would rest from a childhood accident involving broken glass, that she spoke French in public but English in private when she was tired or upset. The specificity of these details struck the room like physical blows. These weren't things a random person would know. These were intimate details that could only come from someone who'd been present, who'd observed closely, who'd been there. Isabel moved closer to Lisette, her voice dropping to a furious whisper. What do you want? Money? Freedom? Name your price and leave before you destroy yourself. I don't want anything you can give, Lisette replied quietly. What I want is for everyone here to understand what they're complicit in, what they've been ignoring, what they've been profiting from while pretending their hands are clean. She raised her voice so everyone could hear. 20 years ago, Marguerite Beaumont discovered something about her family's business, about how the Beaumont fortune was built. She learned that her father had been involved in the illegal slave trade, not just regular slavery, which was evil enough, but the international trade that had been banned by federal law. Ships from Africa bringing human cargo to Louisiana through secret channels, children torn from families, men and women packed into holds like animals, many dying during the voyage. The survivors sold at premium prices to plantations throughout the South. Gasps rippled through the room. This was dangerous knowledge, the kind that could bring federal investigations, destroy businesses, ruin families. Speaking it aloud was incredibly reckless, or incredibly brave. Alexandra stepped forward, his voice shaking with rage and fear. This is slander, lies designed to damage my family's reputation. I'll see you prosecuted for defamation. Will you? And how exactly will you prove these are lies without opening your business records to examination, without allowing investigators to trace your transactions back 20 years? Are you that confident in what they'll find? The question hung in the air, unanswered, because Alexandra wasn't confident, because the records existed, because Marguerite had been right about what her family was doing. Lisette continued, her voice steady despite the emotion building beneath the surface. Marguerite couldn't live with this knowledge. She couldn't sleep knowing her silk dresses and diamond jewelry and comfortable life were purchased with money earned from such horror. She told her husband she was going to expose the business, going to contact federal authorities, going to destroy the Beaumont empire rather than continue benefiting from it. That's when they decided she had to die, not just Alexandra, but all of you who were complicit. She pointed at Thomas Morrison. Your cotton factoring business handled the crops from plantations worked by people brought in through illegal channels. You knew. You profited. She turned to Dr. Duclos. You treated the sailors who worked on those ships when they fell ill. You saw the conditions they described. You stayed silent. To Antoine Devereux, you created false documentation, bills of sale for people who were never legally enslaved, forged papers that made kidnapping look legitimate. Each accusation landed with devastating precision. The men she named couldn't deny the charges without lying, obviously, but confirming them would be admitting to federal crimes. We're getting ahead of ourselves, Dr. Duclos said, trying to sound calm despite the sweat on his forehead. Even if such activities occurred, which I'm not confirming, how does that connect to Marguerite Beaumont's death? She died of yellow fever. There was a physician's report. Yes, your report, Lisette said. The report you wrote after they paid you to declare a murdered woman died of natural causes. I know because I was there that night, hidden in the carriage. I heard everything. The room had gone deathly quiet. Every person present understood they were hearing something that could destroy multiple families. Something that should never be spoken aloud. Yet here they were, trapped between the social obligation to stay and the survival instinct to flee. Lisette's voice softened, taking on a quality that was almost dreamlike as she recounted what she'd witnessed. It was May 16th, 1822, a Thursday night. Marguerite had spent the day writing letters to federal authorities, documenting everything she'd learned. Alexandra discovered what she was doing. He went to Thomas Morrison, to Dr. Duclos, to Antoine Devereux, the men whose businesses would be destroyed if Marguerite succeeded. Together they decided what had to be done. They came to the Beaumont house after midnight. I was sleeping in the small room off Marguerite's chambers, the place where I stayed in case she needed anything during the night. I woke to voices, angry, desperate voices. I looked through the crack in the door and saw them, 5 men surrounding Marguerite, Alexandra, Thomas, Henri, Antoine, and one other I didn't recognize at the time. Later I learned he was Jacques Mercier, the jeweler. Jacques Mercier, who'd been silent until now, made a choking sound. His face had gone grey, his hands trembling as he set down his glass before it fell. Marguerite was calm, Lisette continued. She told them she'd already sent the letters, that it was too late to stop the truth from emerging. But Alexandra said the letters wouldn't matter if she wasn't alive to testify. If there was no one to corroborate the accusations, they told her she was going to die, made her choose between poison or violence. She chose poison, drank it herself rather than let them force it down her throat. She wanted to maintain some dignity even in death. Tears were running down Lisette's face now, but her voice never wavered. I watched her die, watched her convulse and struggle to breathe, watched these men, these respectable gentlemen, stand around her bed and wait for the poison to finish its work. And when she was finally dead, they stripped the diamonds from her body, took the jewelry she'd been wearing, wrapped her corpse in canvas, and carried her out to a carriage. I followed. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could help her somehow even though she was already gone. Maybe I just couldn't let her go alone into whatever they were planning. I hid in the back of the carriage while they drove into the swamp. I watched them throw her body into the water, watched them weight it down with chains so it would sink and never be found. And I heard them discuss how to explain her disappearance. The room was absolutely silent now. Even those who'd come to the salon, knowing nothing about this history, could feel the weight of what was being revealed, the horror of it, the casual cruelty of powerful men disposing of an inconvenient woman like waste. Dr. Duclos would write a report about yellow fever, Lisette said. Antoine Devereux would handle the legal paperwork. Jacques Mercier would quietly sell some of the diamonds through his international contacts, providing money to pay off anyone who asked awkward questions. Thomas Morrison would use his business connections to intercept any correspondence Marguerite had sent, ensuring her accusations never reached federal authorities. And Alexandra Beaumont would play the grieving widower, accepting condolences from a society that never questioned the official story. But they made one mistake. They forgot about the 10-year-old slave girl who saw everything. They didn't realize I was in the carriage, and when they threw Marguerite's body into the swamp, I managed to grab the jewelry box they'd tossed in after her. I held my breath and dove down in the dark water, found the box before it sank too deep, and swam away while they were busy weighing down the body. I escaped through the swamp, nearly died from exhaustion and fear and the animals that hunted there, but I survived. I was found by free people of color who asked no questions about the terrified child with a box of diamonds. They raised me, educated me, helped me understand what I'd witnessed and what it meant. Alexandra Beaumont had collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The other men stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to defend themselves against accusations that were clearly true. Around the room, the assembled guests watched in horrified fascination as their society's foundations crumbled before their eyes. But Lisette wasn't finished. She walked to Isabelle Beaumont, who stood rigid with shock and fury, and spoke directly to her. "You were 12 years old when your mother died, old enough to remember her. Old enough to love her. Did you never question the official story? Did you never wonder why a healthy woman suddenly died of fever with no other cases reported in the city that season? Did you never ask your father about the inconsistencies?" Isabel's voice was barely a whisper. He said she died peacefully, that it was quick, that she didn't suffer. He lied. She suffered terribly, and she died knowing her own husband valued money more than her life, more than her conscience, more than the truth she was trying to expose. Isabel's composure finally shattered. She turned on her father with fury that was decades in the making. "Is this true? Did you murder my mother?" Alexandra couldn't meet her eyes. His silence was answer enough. The salon dissolved into chaos. Guests rushing for exits, not wanting to be associated with what they'd just witnessed. Servants appearing to ask if they should summon authorities, then disappearing when they realized their employers couldn't answer. Isabel screaming at her father while he sat mute, broken by the exposure of secrets he'd protected for 20 years. Robert Morrison grabbed Lisette's arm, his face desperate. "Why now? Why wait 20 years to reveal this? Why not go to authorities when you first escaped?" "Because I was a child, a slave. No one would have believed me. No one would have investigated based on the word of a 10-year-old black girl against 5 prominent white men. I needed time. Time to grow up. Time to gather evidence. Time to understand how power works in this city and how to use that understanding against the men who wielded it." "What evidence? You have testimony but no proof." Lisette smiled, and the expression held no warmth. "Don't I? The diamonds are proof that Marguerite's jewelry didn't go into her grave. The documents I've compiled over 20 years, tracing your father's transactions with illegal slave traders, are proof. The letters Marguerite sent, that I've recovered from various sources, are proof. And most importantly, I have the testimony of others who were involved. Sailors who worked those illegal ships, clerks who handled the paperwork, people you paid off to stay silent, who kept records as insurance. All of it documented, all of it ready to be delivered to federal authorities." She pulled a leather portfolio from beneath her shawl, one she'd been carrying concealed all evening. "Everything is here. 20 years of investigation compiled into evidence that will destroy not just your families, but the entire network of illegal trade you built. I've made multiple copies, given them to people you can't intimidate or silence. If anything happens to me, if I disappear or die under suspicious circumstances, every copy goes public simultaneously." Thomas Morrison's face had gone pale. "What do you want? If you're not here for money or blackmail, what's the point of this revelation?" "Justice," Lisette said simply. "Not just for Marguerite, though she deserves it. Justice for every person brought here in chains through your illegal trade, every family torn apart, every life destroyed. I want the truth spoken aloud where everyone can hear it. I want you to face consequences for what you've done, and I want you to know that evil doesn't stay buried forever. That eventually, always, the truth emerges. She walked toward the door, then turned back for one final statement. I'll be at the federal courthouse tomorrow at noon with all my evidence. I encourage anyone who values justice over comfort to meet me there. And to those of you who've just learned tonight what your society is built on, ask yourselves what you're going to do with that knowledge. Ignorance is no longer an option. You've heard the truth. Now you must decide what that means for who you want to be. With that, Lisette walked out of the Beaumont mansion, her diamonds catching the gaslight one last time before she disappeared into the New Orleans night. Behind her, she left a room full of people who would never be the same, who would spend the rest of their lives deciding whether to acknowledge what they'd heard or try to bury it deeper than Marguerite Beaumont's body. The city's elite stood at a crossroads, and the choice they made in the coming hours would determine whether New Orleans faced its darkness or drowned in it. The hours following Lisette's departure from the Beaumont salon were marked by frantic activity across New Orleans' elite circles. Messengers rode through the night, carrying urgent summons. Men who rarely left their beds before noon dressed in darkness and traveled to secret meetings. And in parlors and studies throughout the Garden District, desperate conversations unfolded about how to contain a disaster that was already beyond containment. Alexandre Beaumont sat in his study with the remains of his inner circle. Thomas Morrison, Dr. Duclos, and Antoine Devereaux had stayed after the other guests fled. Jacques Mercier had disappeared immediately, claiming sudden illness, but everyone knew he was simply the first to abandon the sinking ship. Isabelle had locked herself in her chambers, refusing to speak to her father, her silence more damning than any accusation. "We need to discredit her," Thomas said, pacing the length of the study, "before she reaches the courthouse, before federal authorities take her seriously. We claim she's mentally unstable, a slave suffering from delusions. We can find doctors willing to testify to that." 40 people heard her testimony tonight, Dr. Duclos replied wearily. 40 witnesses who saw her wearing Marguerite's diamonds, who heard details only someone present could know. You can't make that disappear with medical opinions. Then we silence her permanently, Antoine Devereaux said, his voice cold. We've done it before. We can do it again. Alexandre looked up from his hands, his face haggard. And create a martyr? You heard her. She has copies of everything, multiple copies with people we can't reach. If she dies, it all goes public anyway. We're trapped. Then what do you suggest? Thomas demanded. We sit and wait for federal marshals to arrest us? We accept prison and financial ruin? My son will inherit nothing but shame because of this disaster. Robert Morrison, who'd been silent until now, spoke from his position by the window. Maybe we should let them arrest us. Maybe that's what we deserve. The 4 older men turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to fury. What did you say? Thomas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I said maybe we deserve this. Everything she described tonight, it was true. I could see it in your faces. All of you. You killed a woman because she threatened your profits. You trafficked in illegal human cargo. You built empires on suffering and called it business. Maybe consequences are appropriate. Thomas crossed the room and struck his son across the face, the sound sharp in the quiet study. You don't understand the world you live in, the comfort you enjoy, the education you received, the opportunities available to you. All of it exists because men like us made difficult decisions, made necessary compromises. Robert touched his burning cheek, his eyes meeting his father's without flinching. Murder isn't a compromise. It's evil. And I'm done pretending otherwise. He walked toward the door, then paused. I'm going to the courthouse tomorrow. I'm going to testify about what I know, not because I'm brave or moral, but because I can't carry this anymore. The weight of it, the knowledge that everything I am is built on atrocity. After Robert left, the 4 men sat in heavy silence, each contemplating their options, each understanding that the world they'd known was ending and they couldn't stop it. But they could still try. And desperation makes men dangerous. Across the city, in a small room above a bakery on Rampart Street, Lisette wasn't sleeping. She sat at a small desk, writing letters by candlelight. Letters to people who'd helped her over the years. Thanking them. Releasing them from any obligation. Making sure they understood that what came next might be dangerous and they owed her nothing. She knew the powerful men she'd exposed wouldn't surrender easily. Knew they would try to silence her despite the copies of evidence she'd distributed. Knew that walking to the courthouse tomorrow might be the last thing she ever did. But she'd made peace with that possibility years ago. Justice was worth dying for. Truth was worth dying for. Making sure Marguerite Beaumont's murder wasn't forgotten was worth whatever price Lisette might pay. A soft knock interrupted her writing. She tensed, hand moving to the knife she kept beneath her pillow. But the voice that followed was familiar. "It's me. Can I come in?" She opened the door to find Robert Morrison standing in the dim hallway, his face still showing the mark where his father had struck him. He looked younger than his 28 years, vulnerable and lost. "Mr. Morrison, I didn't expect to see you again. I needed to talk to someone who might understand. May I?" She gestured him inside, wary but curious. Robert sat heavily in the room's single chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about my father's involvement in your mistress's death. I knew our business wasn't entirely clean. I knew we dealt with plantation owners who acquired slaves through questionable channels. But I didn't know about the murder, about the illegal trade, about any of it specifically. And now that you do know, I feel like I'm suffocating, like every breath I take is stolen, every dollar I spend was earned through horror. How do you live with that? How do you function knowing you're complicit in monstrous things?" Lisette studied him with something approaching sympathy. "You can't. Not without changing, not without doing something to balance the scales. That's why I'm going to the courthouse tomorrow. It won't undo what was done. Won't bring Marguerite back or free the people who suffered because of your father's business. But it's something. It's truth spoken, where lies have been protected. I want to help. I want to testify, but I'm afraid. Of your father? Of myself. Of discovering I'm capable of the same evil. I look at my father, at Beaumont, at the others, and I see myself in 20 years, justifying cruelty as necessity, calling horror by softer names, protecting comfort over conscience." "Then don't become that," Lisette said simply. "Make different choices. It's not complicated. It's just difficult." Robert looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Seeing not a slave girl or a mysterious figure wearing diamonds, but a woman who'd survived something terrible and spent 20 years fighting to make it mean something. "How old were you when you saw Marguerite die?" 10. "And you carried that alone all these years? The knowledge, the weight of it. How?" "I wasn't alone. The people who found me, who raised me, they shared the burden. And I had a purpose. Revenge, maybe, or justice. The line between them gets blurry sometimes. But it kept me moving forward, kept me from drowning in what I'd witnessed." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people from completely different worlds, connected by the horror that linked all of New Orleans society if you looked beneath the surface long enough. "I should go," Robert said finally. "I just wanted you to know that not everyone in that room tonight will stand against you tomorrow. Some of us will stand with you, for whatever that's worth." After he left, Lisette returned to her letters, but now she wrote with something approaching hope. Maybe this wasn't just about destruction. Maybe it was about the possibility that some people, given the chance to see clearly, would choose better than their fathers had. The next morning broke humid and grey, storm clouds gathering over the city like judgment waiting to fall. Lisette dressed carefully in the same blue silk gown she'd worn to the salon. The diamonds went back on, each piece a statement. She was no longer hiding, no longer pretending. This was who she was, the witness who survived. The child who grew into a woman capable of demanding justice. She left the boarding house at 10 o'clock, giving herself plenty of time to walk to the courthouse. The streets were busy with morning commerce, vendors selling flowers and fish, children running errands, the city conducting its daily business unaware that something significant was about to occur. But Lisette noticed the men following her. 3 of them, trying to look casual but keeping her in sight, hired thugs, most likely, sent to prevent her from reaching the courthouse, or to silence her if the opportunity presented itself. She changed her route, moving into more crowded areas where violence would be difficult. The men followed, staying close but not yet acting. They were waiting for the right moment. A quiet street, an empty alley, somewhere they could do what they'd been paid to do without witnesses. Lisette had anticipated this, had prepared for exactly this scenario. She'd survived the swamp at 10 years old. She wasn't going to die in the streets at 28 without a fight. She turned down Exchange Alley, a narrow passage between buildings that connected Royal Street to Bienville. The men followed, seeing their opportunity. The alley was empty at mid-morning, most businesses not yet open, perfect for what they intended. But Lisette wasn't alone. From doorways and shadows emerged a dozen men and women, free people of color who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. People she'd helped over the years. People who owed her their freedom, their lives, their futures. They surrounded the 3 thugs with expressions that suggested violence was about to become mutual. The lead thug, a scarred man with cold eyes, assessed the situation and apparently decided discretion was worth more than whatever he'd been paid. He and his companions retreated quickly, leaving Lisette with her protectors. "Thank you," she said quietly. "We walk with you to the courthouse," one of them replied. A woman named Marie, who Lisette had helped escape from illegal bondage 5 years earlier. "All of us. We stand witness too." And so Lisette arrived at the federal courthouse, not alone but accompanied by a small crowd, people who'd been victims of the system she was exposing. People who'd survived and wanted their survival to mean something. The courthouse steps were already crowded. Federal marshals stood at the entrance, having been notified that something significant was about to occur. And clustered near the bottom of the steps, clearly there to intimidate, stood representatives of every major family Lisette had exposed. Not Alexandra or Thomas themselves. They were too smart to appear publicly. But their lawyers, their business associates, their hired men, all making clear that they contested Lisette's right to be heard. And standing apart from both groups, looking isolated and uncertain, was Robert Morrison. He'd come as promised, had chosen his side. Lisette climbed the courthouse steps with her protectors flanking her. The leather portfolio containing 20 years of evidence felt heavy in her hands. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The moment when truth would be spoken officially, recorded permanently, made real in ways that couldn't be denied or forgotten. But as she reached for the courthouse door, a commotion erupted behind her. Shouts. The sound of horses being driven too fast through crowded streets. She turned to see a carriage careening toward the courthouse, driving recklessly, people scattering to avoid being trampled. The carriage stopped abruptly at the base of the steps. Alexandre Beaumont emerged, his face desperate and determined. He climbed the steps toward Lisette with surprising speed for a man of his age. "Wait," he called. "Please, wait." Lisette paused. Curious, despite herself, Alexandre stopped a few feet from her, breathing hard, his eyes red from what looked like hours of crying. "What I did was unforgivable," he said, loud enough for everyone on the steps to hear. "I killed my wife because she threatened my business, because I valued money more than her life, more than truth, more than my own soul. I've lived with that guilt for 20 years. It's destroyed me from inside, made me into something monstrous." He pulled papers from his coat. "This is my confession. Everything you were going to expose, I've written down in my own hand. Signed and dated. I'm turning myself in to federal authorities. I'm accepting whatever punishment they decide is appropriate. And I'm asking, begging, that you don't expose the others. Let me take the full weight of this. Let me protect at least some people from the consequences I deserve alone." Lisette studied him, searching for deception and finding only broken honesty. You want to protect your accomplices? The men who helped you murder your wife? I want to protect my daughter, my household, the innocent people who've benefited from my crimes without knowing their source. I'm guilty. I accept that, but I'm asking for mercy for those around me. The same mercy you showed Marguerite? Alexandra flinched. No, I showed her no mercy. That's my eternal shame. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let my confession be enough. Let me pay the price without dragging down everyone connected to me. Lisette felt the weight of decision. She'd spent 20 years planning to destroy everyone involved, to make sure all of them faced consequences. But looking at Alexandra's broken face, at Isabel watching from her carriage with tears streaming down her cheeks, at Robert who'd found the courage to testify despite everything, she wondered if there might be another way. Your confession, she said finally. It needs to include everything, every name, every transaction, every crime. And you accept full punishment under federal law for trafficking in illegal slave trade and murder. Yes, all of it. And the others? Thomas Morrison, Dr. Duclos, Antoine Devereaux, they make restitution. Not to me, to the people they hurt. They establish funds for freed slaves. They use their influence to fight against the systems they profited from. They spend the rest of their lives trying to balance the scales they tip toward evil. Alexandra nodded, hope flickering in his eyes. I'll make sure of it, I swear. And the truth still comes out. Your confession becomes public record. Everyone knows what you did, your reputation, your family's standing, all of it destroyed. That's not negotiable. I understand. Lisette looked at the federal marshals waiting at the courthouse door, at the crowd that had gathered, sensing something historic was occurring, at Robert Morrison, who'd chosen conscience over comfort, at Marie and the others who'd walked with her because they understood what justice meant when you'd been denied it your whole life. Then we have an agreement, she said finally. You face justice, the others make restitution, and the truth is told so that Marguerite Beaumont's death means something, so that everyone understands what this city's wealth has been built on. Alexandra handed his confession to the federal marshals, who took it with expressions suggesting they understood its significance. The senior marshal looked at Lisette. You have additional evidence? She handed him the leather portfolio, 20 years of documentation, names, dates, transactions, everything needed to understand the full scope of what occurred. The marshal flipped through the papers, his face growing grimmer with each page. Finally, he looked up at the assembled crowd. This is now a federal matter. I'm placing Alexandra Beaumont under arrest for murder and trafficking in illegal human cargo. Anyone else named in these documents should consider themselves under investigation. If you have information relevant to these crimes, federal authorities expect your cooperation. As marshals led Alexandra away in chains, the crowd began to disperse. Some looked satisfied, others seemed troubled by what they'd witnessed. But everyone understood that New Orleans had changed today, that a secret buried for 20 years had been exposed and nothing would be the same. Robert approached Lisette on the courthouse steps. What you did today, it took courage I'm not sure I'll ever have. You were here, you chose to stand up, that's courage. It's the beginning. I have a lot to make up for. A lot to learn about how to live differently than my father did. Then learn and teach others. That's how change happens, one person at a time, deciding to be better than what came before. Isabelle Beaumont climbed the steps to where Lisette stood. Her face was composed, but her eyes held decades of pain and confusion. I don't know whether to thank you or hate you. You've destroyed my family. Your father destroyed your family when he killed your mother. I just made sure the truth didn't stay buried with her. Will you tell me about her? About my mother in those last months? I want to understand who she was beyond the sanitized memory I've carried. Lisette considered the request, then nodded. Yes, she deserves to be remembered fully, as the woman who tried to do the right thing even when it cost everything. The two women walked down the courthouse steps together, daughter of the murdered woman and the girl who'd witnessed it, connected by tragedy but perhaps capable of building something new from its ruins. As Lisette left the courthouse, she removed the diamonds one by one, the necklace, the earrings, the bracelets, the tiara. She placed them in a box and handed them to a federal marshal. These belong to Marguerite Beaumont. They should be returned to her daughter. They're not symbols of murder anymore, just jewelry, just things. She walked away from the courthouse lighter than she'd felt in 20 years. The weight of that night in the swamp, of Marguerite's death, of carrying justice alone for so long, finally lifted. Not gone. Never completely gone. But bearable now. Shared, made into something more than just pain. Behind her, New Orleans began the painful process of reckoning with truths it had tried to bury. Some would choose denial, some would choose change, but none of them could claim ignorance anymore. The slave girl who wore diamonds had spoken truth in a place where lies had reigned. And truth, once spoken, is very hard to silence. The trial of Alexandre Beaumont began 3 weeks after his confession on the courthouse steps. Federal prosecutors moved quickly, recognizing that the case represented something larger than one man's crimes. It was an opportunity to expose the infrastructure of illegal slave trading that had persisted in Louisiana despite federal prohibition. An opportunity to demonstrate that wealth and social position couldn't shield people from consequences indefinitely. The trial was held in the same courthouse where Lisette had delivered her evidence, but this time the proceedings were formal, recorded, and covered by newspapers throughout the South. Every day, the courtroom filled with spectators. Some came to witness justice, others came hoping to see the prosecution fail, to watch the old order reassert itself and prove that men like Beaumont couldn't really be held accountable. Lisette attended every day of the trial, sitting in the public gallery with Marie and others who'd walked with her to the courthouse. She wore simple clothes now, no longer needing diamonds to command attention. Her testimony on the 4th day lasted 6 hours. She recounted everything she'd witnessed that night in 1822, every detail of Marguerite's murder, every name of the men involved, every word of their conversations as they disposed of the body. Defense attorneys tried to discredit her. They emphasized her age at the time, suggesting a child's memories couldn't be trusted. They noted her enslaved status, implying that slaves were inherently unreliable witnesses. They questioned why she'd waited 20 years to come forward, suggesting her story was fabricated for attention or profit. But Lisette's testimony was too specific, too detailed, too clearly true to be dismissed. And when prosecutors presented the physical evidence, the diamonds that matched Beaumont family records, the letters Marguerite had written documenting the illegal trade, the financial records showing transactions with known smugglers, the defense collapsed. No amount of legal maneuvering could overcome the weight of truth supported by documentation. Alexandre Beaumont was convicted on multiple counts: murder, conspiracy to commit murder, trafficking in illegal human cargo, operating a criminal enterprise. The judge, a federal appointee from Massachusetts who had no loyalty to Louisiana's social hierarchy, sentenced him to life imprisonment. He would die in a federal prison in Pennsylvania 7 years later, having lost everything: his fortune, his family, his name, all of it destroyed by the crime he'd thought safely buried. But Alexandre's conviction was only the beginning. The trial had exposed names and connections that federal prosecutors couldn't ignore. Thomas Morrison, Dr. Henri Duclos, and Antoine Devereaux were all indicted based on evidence presented during Alexandre's trial. Jacques Mercier fled to France before he could be arrested, living in exile for the rest of his life, his once prestigious jewelry business seized by federal authorities. Thomas Morrison's trial revealed the full scope of the illegal slave trade operating through New Orleans. Ships arriving at night with human cargo from Africa and the Caribbean. False documentation created to make kidnapped free people appear legally enslaved. A network of corruption involving customs officials, port authorities, and local law enforcement. The testimony exposed not just individual crimes, but a system that had operated for decades with the knowledge and participation of New Orleans elite. Thomas was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His business was dismantled, his assets seized, his family's reputation destroyed. Robert Morrison, who had testified against his own father, inherited nothing but shame and the burden of deciding what to do with that inheritance. Dr. Duclos and Antoine Devereaux both accepted plea bargains, confessing to their roles in Marguerite's murder and the illegal trade in exchange for reduced sentences. Both men spent years in prison. Both emerged broken, their professional lives destroyed, their names synonymous with corruption and evil. The trials sent shockwaves through Southern society. If men as powerful as Alexandra Beaumont and Thomas Morrison could be convicted and imprisoned, no one was safe. If federal authorities were willing to investigate illegal slave trading this aggressively, every family involved in the commerce had reason to fear. The trials didn't end slavery. That would take a war and another 20 years. But they cracked the certainty that had allowed the system to function without serious challenge. Lisette watched these consequences unfold with mixed feelings. She'd wanted justice for Marguerite. She'd wanted the men who murdered her held accountable. But she also understood that individual convictions didn't fundamentally change the system that had made those crimes possible. Slavery itself continued. People were still bought and sold. Families were still torn apart. Individual evil had been punished, but structural evil remained intact. 6 months after Alexandra's conviction, Lisette sat in a small office on Royal Street, meeting with Robert Morrison and Isabelle Beaumont. The three of them had formed an unlikely alliance, united by their connection to the crimes that had destroyed their families and their shared desire to make something constructive from the wreckage. "We want to establish a foundation," Robert said, laying papers on the desk between them. "Using what remains of my family's assets and Isabel's inheritance. Money to help enslaved people purchase their freedom. Resources for free people of color seeking education and employment. Legal assistance for those challenging their bondage. It won't undo what was done," Isabel added. "It won't bring my mother back or free the people your father trafficked. But it's something. It's an attempt to use money earned through evil for something constructive." Lisette studied the documents carefully. The foundation would be real, substantial, funded with enough capital to make a genuine difference. It represented a fortune diverted from supporting slavery to undermining it. A small victory, perhaps, but meaningful. "I'll help," she said finally. "But on one condition. The foundation's work must be public, not hidden, not subtle. It needs to be visible enough that other wealthy families see it and understand they have a choice. They can keep profiting from slavery, or they can use their resources to fight against it. They need to see that the second option exists." "Agreed," Robert said. "We'll make it public. We'll make it a challenge to others like us." The foundation they established became one of the first of its kind in the South. Over the following years, it would help hundreds of enslaved people purchase freedom. It would fund schools for free black children. It would provide legal assistance to people challenging their bondage. And it would serve as a model for others who wanted to use wealth constructively rather than just accumulating it through exploitation. But the foundation was only one response to the trials. New Orleans as a whole struggled with what had been revealed. Some families doubled down on their support for slavery, seeing the prosecutions as federal overreach rather than justice. They closed ranks, protecting remaining members of the illegal trade network, making it clear they wouldn't cooperate with further investigations. Others, particularly younger people like Robert, began questioning the system they'd inherited. Not just the illegal trade, but slavery itself. Whether it could be morally justified under any circumstances, whether wealth built on human bondage was worth having. These questions created divisions in families, ended friendships, realigned social networks. The comfortable certainty that had characterized New Orleans' elite society was gone, replaced by moral confusion and contested values. The city's free black community watched these developments with cautious hope. The trials had demonstrated that white men could be held accountable for crimes against black people. That testimony from black witnesses could be credited by courts. That justice was at least theoretically possible, even in a slave society. These were significant shifts, even if they didn't fundamentally alter power dynamics. Lizette became a figure of significance in New Orleans' free black community. People sought her counsel, asked her to speak at gatherings, wanted to learn from her experience of bringing powerful men to account. She was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the attention, but she came to understand that her story had value beyond personal vindication. It demonstrated that resistance was possible, that truth could overcome power if pursued with enough determination and courage. One evening, nearly a year after the trials, Lizette was invited to speak at a gathering in a black church on Claiborne Avenue. The church was packed with people wanting to hear from the woman who'd brought down Alexandra Beaumont. She stood at the pulpit, looking out at faces ranging from children to elderly people who'd survived decades of bondage, and she spoke not about revenge, but about endurance. "What I did wasn't heroic," she said. "It was survival. I witnessed something terrible as a child, and I carried that knowledge for 20 years. I could have let it destroy me. Many people in similar circumstances do. The weight of trauma is crushing. But I found people who helped me carry it, who gave me purpose beyond just surviving, who showed me that witnessing evil creates an obligation to speak truth about it. Justice for Marguerite Beaumont doesn't undo her murder. Convictions of the men who killed her don't restore her life. But speaking the truth matters anyway. It matters because silence protects evil. It matters because the powerful rely on victims staying quiet. It matters because every time we speak truth about what was done to us, we chip away at the foundations of systems built on lies. Some of you have survived horrors I can't imagine. Some of you carry stories you've never been able to tell because no one with power would listen. I'm telling you tonight that your stories matter. Your testimony matters. Your truth matters, even if it never reaches a courtroom or results in convictions. Speaking truth is an act of resistance. Remembering is an act of resistance. Surviving is an act of resistance. The system that enslaves people wasn't built in a day. It won't fall in a day, but it will fall. Systems built on evil always eventually collapse under their own weight. Our job is to survive until that collapse, to preserve our stories, to pass our truths to the next generation, to make sure that when this evil system finally dies, as it will, there's a record of what it did and who fought against it. The response to her speech was overwhelming. People wept. People stood and shared their own stories. People who'd been silent for years found voices in that church, speaking truths about their experiences that had never been spoken aloud before. And Lizette understood that this was part of what justice looked like. Not just courtroom convictions, but communities finding space to acknowledge pain and resistance. The foundation established by Robert and Isabel continued its work, and as it did, something unexpected happened. Other wealthy families began contributing. Small amounts at first, donations made anonymously to avoid social censure, but gradually, more openly. The trials had shaken some people's certainty, had made them question whether the wealth they enjoyed justified the system that produced it. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to matter. By 1845, 3 years after the trials, New Orleans had changed in ways both subtle and significant. The illegal slave trade had been disrupted, though not eliminated entirely. Federal authorities maintained a presence, investigating suspicious shipments and questionable documentation. Some families had withdrawn from the commerce entirely, recognizing the legal risks weren't worth the profits. Others had become more careful, more secretive, more willing to bribe officials to look the other way. The social hierarchy remained largely intact. Creole families still dominated, wealth still determined position, slavery still provided the foundation for Louisiana's economy. But cracks had appeared in the edifice. Questions that couldn't be asked in 1842 were being discussed by 1845. Not openly, not in polite company, but in private conversations between people willing to acknowledge doubt. Lisette eventually left New Orleans. The city held too many ghosts, too many memories of that night in the swamp. She traveled north, settling eventually in Boston, where she could live as a free woman without constantly looking over her shoulder for men sent to silence her. But she stayed in contact with Robert and Isabel, watching from a distance as they continued the Foundation's work. She never married, never had children. Some who knew her said she'd given her life to Marguerite's memory, that justice for her mistress had consumed everything else. Others said she'd simply recognized that her value lay in telling a story no one else could tell, in being a witness to things that powerful people wanted forgotten. In 1857, 15 years after the trials, Lisette received a letter from Isabel. Alexandre Beaumont had died in prison. His last words, according to a guard who was present, were, "Forgive me, Marguerite. Forgive me." He'd spent his final years in relative isolation, shunned even by other prisoners who understood what he'd done. His death prompted a brief resurgence of newspaper coverage, reminding people of the trials and the corruption they'd exposed. Isabel wrote that she'd visited her father once in prison 2 years before his death. She'd needed to confront him, to hear directly from him why he'd valued money more than his wife's life. Alexandra had no good answer. He'd tried to explain about pressure and expectations and the way business was done, but stripped of his wealth and power, sitting in a prison cell, those justifications sounded as hollow as they were. "He asked me to forgive him," Isabel wrote to Lisette. "I told him I couldn't. That forgiveness wasn't mine to give, it was my mother's, and she was beyond reach of his apologies. He wept then. I'd never seen my father cry before. It didn't make me feel better. It just made me sad that it took losing everything for him to recognize what he'd done." Lisette wrote back, telling Isabel that her mother would be proud of the woman she'd become, that Marguerite's death had been terrible and wrong, but that something constructive had grown from the tragedy. The Foundation had helped hundreds of people. Isabel's testimony about her mother's principles had inspired others to question the system. Good hadn't erased evil, but it had responded to it in ways that mattered. If you're moved by stories of resistance and buried truths finally brought to light, you'll want to explore more of these forgotten histories. Here at the Sealed Room, we specialize in uncovering the stories that powerful people tried to erase. Stories of people who fought against impossible odds, who demanded justice when justice seemed impossible, who refused to let evil go unchallenged. Subscribe so you don't miss these investigations into America's hidden past. These stories deserve to be remembered. The Civil War came in 1861, 19 years after Lisette's confrontation on the courthouse steps. The foundation she'd helped establish continued its work throughout the war, assisting formerly enslaved people in establishing new lives. Robert Morrison served in the Union Army, one of relatively few white Southerners who fought to end slavery. He survived the war and spent his remaining years teaching at a school for freed people in Atlanta. Isabel Beaumont used her remaining wealth to support Reconstruction efforts, working to build a society that didn't depend on bondage. Lisette lived to see slavery abolished. She was 42 years old when the 13th Amendment was ratified, old enough to remember clearly the world before and to appreciate the magnitude of what had changed. She wrote in her journal that day, "Marguerite fought for this, died for it. Her death didn't directly cause this victory, but it was part of the larger struggle. Every person who resisted slavery, every voice that spoke truth about its evil, every act of courage and defiance, all of it added up to this moment. I'm grateful to have survived long enough to see it." She died in 1873 at age 51, outliving Alexandra Beaumont by 16 years. Her obituary in Boston newspapers noted her role in exposing corruption in New Orleans, but didn't capture the full scope of her life. How she'd been enslaved as a child, how she'd witnessed murder, how she'd survived the swamp and 20 years of gathering evidence. How she'd stood on courthouse steps wearing diamonds and demanded justice from men who'd thought themselves beyond accountability. But those who'd known her passed her story down, and in New Orleans, in the community of people who'd walked with her to the courthouse, her memory was preserved. She became an example of what courage looked like, of what persistence could accomplish, of how one person refusing to stay silent could change things. The diamonds themselves, returned to Isabel after the trial, were eventually sold. The money was donated to the foundation, used to build a school for black children in New Orleans. The school operated until 1877, when Reconstruction ended and white supremacist governments regained control of Louisiana. But for 12 years, it provided education to hundreds of children who otherwise would have had none. A legacy built on stones that had once symbolized murder, transformed into something constructive. The mystery of the slave girl who wore diamonds became part of New Orleans folklore. Stories circulated with varying levels of accuracy. Some versions made Lisette into a romantic figure, a tragic heroine fighting for doomed love. Others turned her into a symbol of black resistance, which was more accurate but still simplified the complexity of her experience. A few people who'd actually known her tried to preserve the real story, but memory is unreliable and details blurred over time. What survived with clarity was the essential truth that a girl enslaved at 10 years old had witnessed her mistress murdered by powerful men, that she'd escaped with diamonds that shouldn't exist, that she'd waited 20 years and then demanded justice in a society designed to deny her any standing to demand anything, that she'd succeeded in bringing those men to account through courage and patience and determination that most people couldn't imagine sustaining. The story reminds us of several uncomfortable truths about American history, that the wealth of elite families was often built on crimes they went to great lengths to hide. That murder and corruption were tools of business for people who considered themselves respectable. That the slavery system created conditions where such crimes could occur with relative impunity. And that resistance existed even in the darkest times, even when it seemed futile, even when the powerful appeared invulnerable. Lisette's story also reveals something about the nature of justice in an unjust society. She got convictions, she saw powerful men imprisoned, she exposed corruption that shocked the nation. But slavery continued for 2 more decades after her testimony. The structural evil that had made Marguerite's murder possible remained intact. Individual accountability didn't translate into systemic change, at least not immediately. Yet her actions mattered. The trials she initiated did disrupt the illegal slave trade, did inspire others to question the system, did demonstrate that accountability was theoretically possible even for the powerful. Did preserve truth about crimes that would otherwise have been forgotten. Justice was incomplete, as justice usually is, but it was real. The question her story poses to us is what we do with knowledge of historical evil. Do we look away because it's uncomfortable? Do we minimize it because acknowledging its full scope would require reconsidering narratives we find comforting? Or do we face it directly, understanding that only by acknowledging what happened can we work to prevent similar evils? Lisette chose to face it, to speak truth about what she'd witnessed even when doing so was dangerous, to demand justice even when justice seemed impossible, to survive not just physically but morally, maintaining her humanity despite experiencing inhumanity. That choice cost her a normal life, cost her the possibility of forgetting, cost her peace. But it preserved truth. And truth, once preserved, has power that extends far beyond the individual who speaks it. What do you think drove men like Alexandre Beaumont to murder rather than face exposure of their crimes? How do we reckon with wealth that was built on such foundations? What would it mean to truly address the legacy of slavery and the violence used to maintain it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. These conversations are how we process difficult history together. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about New Orleans or American history or the nature of justice, share it with someone. These stories need to be told. These truths need to be remembered. Subscribe so you're notified when we post new investigations into buried histories. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story we uncover. And remember, history isn't just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing patterns that continue into the present, the willingness to commit crimes for profit, the impulse to bury evidence rather than face accountability. The way power protects itself through silence and intimidation. These aren't just historical phenomena, they're ongoing realities that require ongoing resistance. Lisette understood that. She survived not just to get justice for Marguerite Beaumont, but to demonstrate that resistance was possible. That truth could overcome power if pursued with enough courage and determination. That victims of injustice didn't have to accept the roles powerful people assigned them. Her legacy isn't just the convictions she secured or the foundation she helped establish, it's the example she set. Of survival becoming resistance, of witnessing becoming testimony, of one person's courage rippling outward to inspire others. The slave girl who wore diamonds walked into New Orleans' most exclusive salon and shattered the comfortable lies that sustained its elite society. She forced confrontation with buried crimes. She demanded accountability from people who'd thought themselves beyond reach. And she did it all, knowing she might not survive the attempt. That's the power of truth, spoken by someone who refuses to stay silent. That's the legacy of Lisette, who wore diamonds not as ornaments but as evidence, who transformed jewelry meant to symbolize wealth into weapons against the people who'd accumulated that wealth through murder and trafficking. Her story was nearly lost. New Orleans tried to forget it, tried to bury it as deeply as Marguerite Beaumont's body. But truth has a way of surfacing, stories persist, and now, more than 180 years after Lisette stood on those courthouse steps, we can remember what she did and what it cost and what it accomplished. We can honor her not just by remembering, but by recognizing that her fight continues. That systems of oppression still exist, that power still tries to silence truth, that resistance is still necessary. Until next time, keep questioning what you've been told. Keep searching for the stories that were deliberately hidden. Keep demanding truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. That's how we honor people like Lisette. That's how we make sure their courage meant something.